I found out my wife had gone to a singles party with her friends. It was just another evening, one that didn't hold much significance. I had just wrapped up work and, by sheer coincidence, drove past the bar where the event was happening. It's not the kind of place I usually stop at, but that night, something compelled me to walk in. The moment I stepped inside, the music blared so loud it swallowed the constant chatter of people, neon lights flashed erratically, and the heavy mix of alcohol and perfume lingered in the air. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a beer, and started casually observing the crowd. That's when my eyes caught sight of someone I knew all too well. She was laughing, surrounded by her friends, clearly enjoying herself. But this wasn't just anyone. No, it was her. The woman I had spent years of my life with, the one I had built dreams and made promises with. My wife. The shock hit me in waves. She had betrayed me. But it wasn't the party itself that froze my blood, it was the setting, the carefree energy, and how she acted with her friends, as if nothing in the world mattered. She didn't notice me right away, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. Everything around me felt like it had slowed down, and my mind raced with a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. What was she doing here? Did I even know the woman I married? My heart pounded in my chest, and the bottle in my hand suddenly felt too heavy. For a fleeting moment, I considered getting up and leaving, pretending I hadn't seen her. But something inside held me back. Then, her eyes met mine. In an instant, her entire expression shifted. The smile vanished, and the laughter that had echoed seconds ago dissolved into silent panic. It felt as if time had come to a halt. She stood there, frozen, as if she had been caught in the act, unable to move, unable to speak. That one look between us said everything that needed saying. What was going to happen now? The truth was already unbearable, but the worst part was knowing I was about to uncover something much darker than I had ever imagined. For months, I'd sensed that something was off. The mysterious phone calls she claimed were work-related, the late nights out with friends where she came home well after midnight, always with the excuse that they were just chatting, it all seemed flimsy, too convenient. And now, here she was, tangled in a world I never thought she'd be part of. As she finally started to make her way toward me, hesitant with each step, I realized this was much more than a simple case of betrayal. There was a deep chasm between us, one she had been carving out for a long time, and I had been blind to see it. When she opened her mouth, no words came out at first. I can explain, she stammered, struggling to find some excuse, any excuse, that would somehow make this less terrible than it already was. But nothing she could say would change what I now knew. Worse still, there were things I didn't know yet, things I was about to discover. The past few months played back in my mind like a movie. Every hurried word she spoke, every gesture I took at face value, every time I trusted her without question, it all clicked into place. That gut feeling, the gnawing sense that something was wrong, that empty pit in my stomach I tried to ignore, it was all there, waiting to blow up in my face. She had cheated, but what else lay beneath the surface? I took a deep breath, bracing myself. The pain of her betrayal cut deep, like a knife stabbing over and over again. But the worst hadn't even come yet. She had more to tell me, something I dreaded hearing, something that went beyond just infidelity. Her silence in that moment was already confessing more than her words ever could. This wasn't just about a party or a single night. It was about decisions made in the shadows, secrets kept for who knows how long, and choices that would turn our lives upside down forever. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, silently begging for my understanding. But how could anyone possibly forgive the unforgivable? In that single moment, every promise we'd ever made to each other seemed to crumble, leaving me with just one nagging question: how far does this really go? What else are you keeping from me? Meanwhile, her friends, oblivious to the storm brewing between us, continued laughing and clinking glasses, as if the lightness of the evening was untouchable. But for us, the air had grown thick, and each second dragged on like an eternity. She looked desperate, and I stood there, teetering on the edge of a decision I wasn't quite ready to make. Yet, deep down, I knew I couldn't simply walk away. Something bigger was coming, something that would change everything. In that heavy silence between us, with just a single look, I felt it. The consequences of whatever was about to unfold were unavoidable, and I wasn't prepared for what she was about to say. I thought I understood the depths of pain, but that night, I was about to learn that pain runs far deeper than I'd ever imagined, and this betrayal was only the beginning of a never-ending descent. Finally, she gathered the courage to speak, and when she did, the words shattered the air like a brutal punch. "Maybe we could have an open marriage," she said, her voice trembling. Those words cut through the quiet with a force that knocked the wind out of me. In that instant, I knew there was no coming back from this. Right there, in that cramped bar, surrounded by music and the distant sound of her friends' laughter, our marriage was falling apart in front of us. But I sensed there was still more, something she hadn't said yet, and I was about to find out what it was. All I had to do was listen, with my heart locked up tight and my mind bracing for the worst. But was the worst still on its way? The real question now was, what else was I about to discover? James sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the soft morning light filtering through the thin curtains. The room was filled with a heavy silence, and downstairs, he could hear the faint sound of Megan's footsteps. They had been together for over a decade, since their college days, back when everything had felt simpler. Their love had blossomed slowly, with long conversations that stretched into the night and passionate kisses that sealed promises they believed could never be broken. Back then, they swore nothing would ever tear them apart. But life had a way of changing things. Routine had crept into their lives, almost unnoticed at first, but now, looking back, James could see the difference. That spark in Megan's eyes seemed dimmer, not from a lack of love, but from the weight of familiarity, the burden of the responsibilities they both carried. He sighed, reflecting on how distant they had become in recent months. The laughter and shared confidences that once filled their days had been replaced by long silences. Megan, on the other hand, had become good at hiding her emotions. She felt the same sense of distance deep in her chest but couldn't quite pinpoint when it had started. James had always been a good husband, hardworking, attentive, always thinking about their future. But the monotony, the repetition of their daily routines, the feeling of being stuck in a life that never changed, it was all starting to suffocate her. At first, Megan had brushed it off as just a rough patch. Every couple goes through ups and downs, right? That's what she kept telling herself. But when that phase dragged on for over a year, Megan began to question if it really was just a phase. Slowly, she started to seek distractions, going out more often with friends, picking up new hobbies, accepting work trips that took her away from home more frequently. James noticed her growing absences, but wrapped up in his own work, he never asked the questions that might have confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. Maybe, deep down, James didn't want to know the answers. They lived in a cozy, well-decorated home, with modern touches they'd picked out together. Every corner of that house held memories, like the big couch in the living room, where they used to spend lazy afternoons watching movies and laughing at the same old comedies. Now, that couch felt emptier. The dining table, once the place where they'd talk endlessly about the future, was rarely used for long conversations anymore. Even their bedroom, where countless nights had been filled with passion, now seemed to serve as nothing more than a place to sleep, with the connection between them all but gone. Despite it all, James remained committed to his duties as a husband. He still believed their love could be revived, that the weariness brought on by the daily grind was just a temporary hurdle. When he looked at Megan, he still saw the woman he had fallen for all those years ago, and his love for her hadn't wavered, even after so much time had passed. He loved her deeply, hoping things would somehow turn around. Megan, on the other hand, kept up the appearance of normalcy. She was well aware of how hard James worked to keep things afloat, and a part of her felt guilty for not feeling the same intensity of love she once had. The truth was, routine had choked out the romance that used to make her feel like she was walking on air. In recent months, she had started seeking out distractions beyond their home, moments where she could just be herself, Megan, without the weight of marriage or expectations hanging over her. James worked for a growing tech company, and the job kept demanding more and more of his time. Meetings often dragged on late into the night, and by the time he came home, he was too drained to engage in much conversation. He knew things between them had shifted, but he always thought there'd be time to fix it. During vacation, he'd tell himself, when we can finally focus on just us, everything will fall back into place. Meanwhile, Megan started spending more time with her friends, especially those who didn't have kids or who led lives free from heavy responsibilities. Her outings became more frequent, and she always explained them away as a chance to unwind and disconnect. In those moments, surrounded by light-hearted conversations with no talk of obligations, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in a long while. James noticed the growing distance, but he chose to believe it was only temporary. He tried to compensate for her absence with small gestures of affection, making her breakfast before heading to work, or sending her little texts in the middle of the day to check in and ask how she was doing. Megan, however, would receive these gestures with a forced smile, responding in a way that felt mechanical, lacking the warmth she once had. It felt like they were living in two parallel worlds, both occupying the same house but not really connecting. When they did spend time together, their conversation stayed on the surface. James would ask about her day, and Megan would give short replies, quickly shifting to more generic topics. The nights they spent together were quiet but devoid of any real intimacy, filled with a kind of comfortable silence that would have been unbearable just months ago. In James's mind, all of this was just a phase, something temporary. He believed that with enough time, effort, and the love they shared, they could get through any rough patch. He had seen other marriages face tough times, and he always believed theirs was strong enough to weather any storm. He convinced himself that it was only a matter of time before things went back to the way they used to be. Megan, however, saw their marriage as something that had already changed beyond repair. Although she still had feelings for James, she wasn't sure if that love was enough to keep going the way they were. The emotional exhaustion weighed heavily on her, and she found herself craving the moments when she was away from home, when she could be a different version of herself, free from James's questioning eyes and the silent pressure to be the perfect wife. It was in those moments, away from their life together, that she started to ask herself what she truly wanted. One night, after a typical outing with her friends, Megan walked into the house to find James sitting on the couch, reading over some work documents. He glanced up, offering a tired smile, and asked how her evening had gone. "Good. The girls are doing well," she replied casually, her tone light. Without saying much more, he went back to his report, and she headed upstairs to their bedroom, already thinking about when she could next escape the weight of everything. James, deep down, could feel something was breaking between them. He sensed it, but he wasn't ready to confront it. He held on to the belief that the love they had spent years building would be strong enough to pull them through. But each of Megan's half-hearted smiles, each routine gesture lacking warmth, and every night she spent out left invisible marks on him. Still, he convinced himself that things would get better, that his love alone could be enough for the both of them. But the cracks were growing deeper, and with every passing day, the distance between them widened. For Megan, the life she once thought would last forever now felt distant, almost foreign. She was beginning to feel disconnected from the version of herself that had once imagined this future with James. The quiet tension between them kept building, creeping into every moment until it became impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each day. Mornings passed in silence, and dinners, when they even happened, were filled with shallow exchanges and stolen glances that never met. Megan continued her routine of going out with friends, while James, increasingly consumed by work, tried to find comfort in the small, fleeting moments that still connected them. He knew, deep down, that he was holding on to the remnants of what their relationship had once been. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to let go of the hope that they could still fix things. One evening, as Megan was getting ready for yet another night out, she stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same one who had fallen in love with James all those years ago. There was a distance in her eyes, a coldness she couldn't shake, even when she tried to hide it from herself. She knew this couldn't go on much longer, but the courage to face the truth eluded her. Part of her still wanted to believe that these nights out, this distance, was just her trying to find herself again. But deep down, a voice inside her warned that she was on the verge of making everything fall apart. From the other room, James watched her getting ready, just as he did every night before she went out. He didn't say a word. A while back, he had decided that confronting her about these absences would only put another wall between them. But this night felt different. Megan seemed more distant than usual, and the forced smile she gave him before leaving carried a weight he couldn't ignore. She mumbled something about coming home late and walked out, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Left alone in the quiet house, James felt the need to clear his head. He grabbed his car keys and headed out for a drive, not caring where he went. The night air was cold, the wind slipping through the cracked windows, and the low hum of the engine was the only sound that accompanied him as he drove aimlessly through the empty streets. The streets were nearly empty, and as James drove, his thoughts drifted back over the last few months, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything started to crumble. He couldn't remember. The changes between them had been so slow, so subtle, that they seemed almost designed to go unnoticed until it was far too late. As he continued driving, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest, growing stronger with each passing mile. A part of him urged him to stop avoiding the truth. Something was going on, he knew it. It wasn't just about Megan going out with friends or offering vague excuses anymore. It was more than that. He never wanted to be the kind of man who doubted his own wife, but the puzzle pieces simply didn't fit. Distrust gnawed at him, no matter how hard he tried to push it away. And so, James made a decision he never thought he would. He decided to follow her. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew he couldn't live with the not knowing anymore. He headed toward the bar where Megan and her friends often met, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't notice him. The bar was bustling with people, and he parked across the street, in the shadows where he could watch without being seen. The loud thump of music spilled out into the night, and the laughter of the crowd contrasted sharply with the tension building inside him. Megan was there, laughing like always. But tonight, something felt different. She wasn't just with her friends. A man James had never seen before approached Megan, and there was something about the way he moved, so casual yet intimate, that sent a chill down James's spine. The man was tall, confident, with an easy smile that seemed all too familiar with the group. Megan's friends didn't seem fazed by his presence, they were laughing and chatting with him as if he had always been part of the scene. James could feel his heart pounding. He watched from his car, unease turning into dread. The man placed his hand on Megan's shoulder, the kind of touch that wasn't accidental. It was intimate, comfortable, as if it wasn't the first time. Megan didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, leaning into the conversation like she wanted it. James's chest tightened, cold sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Every little movement, every gesture, confirmed the fear that had been eating at him for months. Her laughter, the way she tilted her head when the man spoke, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. Megan wasn't just there with her friends. His stomach dropped, and it felt as though the air had been sucked right out of his lungs. He sat frozen, unsure of what to do next. Part of him wanted to jump out of the car, march over to her, and demand answers. But another part of him was paralyzed, as if his body couldn't move, trapped in that moment of realization. He watched as Megan stood up from the table and walked toward the exit, the man following closely behind. James's legs felt weak as the gravity of what was happening sank in. Megan glanced around, checking to see if anyone familiar was watching, and then she and the man walked toward a car parked just a few meters away. They got inside together, the door shutting with a finality that made James's blood boil. Inside that car, the silence screamed louder than any confrontation ever could. The truth was laid out before him, undeniable. Megan was betraying him, the trust they'd built, the love they had shared, the promises they had made. The betrayal that James had tried so hard to deny was now painfully clear, raw and unbearable. He sat there, motionless, watching the quiet street and the subtle movements inside the other vehicle. James wasn't the type to lash out in anger or confront anyone with aggression, but the despair gripped him, clouding his mind. The pain of her betrayal was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a hollow emptiness that gnawed at him, a wound that he knew would take a long time to heal, if it ever could. So he remained in his car, still and silent, as the night stretched on, the cold air swirling around him. Inside the other car, Megan and the man were isolated from the world, and the confirmation of James's worst fears was right in front of him, too real to ignore. The image of Megan smiling at another man, the effortless way she betrayed him, it all burned in James's mind like a fire that refused to die. There were no more doubts, no more room for excuses. All that remained was the cold, hard truth: his marriage was shattered. He glanced at the clock on the car's dashboard, but it seemed frozen in time, much like him. He couldn't move. The cold night outside clashed with the heat of the rage he kept bottled up inside, and as each minute passed, he knew he was on the verge of making a decision that would change everything. James sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the car where Megan sat with another man. Everything around him seemed to blur, the world dissolving in slow motion. It was as if he were trapped inside a distorted reality. His mind raced in circles, torn between disbelief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of heartbreak. Each breath was a struggle, and every beat of his heart felt like a hammer pounding inside his chest. Still, he didn't move. He just sat there, watching, while his mind tried to catch up with what his eyes had already confirmed: Megan had betrayed him. Not just tonight, but probably for much longer than he had realized. How had he missed the signs? How had he been so blind to what was happening right in front of him? The clock read midnight. He didn't know how long it had been since Megan got into that car, but it felt like an eternity. The agony of seeing her with someone else was unbearable. A part of him wanted to rush over, fling open the door, and demand answers. He wanted to shout, to ask why, to make her explain. But another part of him, the part that was the most wounded, just wanted to run away. The truth wouldn't change what he already knew, but confronting it felt necessary, somehow. After what felt like hours, the other car's headlights flicked on. Megan and the man left the bar, and James watched as she said a quick goodbye, no fanfare, no second thoughts. She got into her car as effortlessly as she had entered his life so many years ago, then headed home. James followed at a safe distance, careful not to be seen. When they arrived at the house, James waited in his car for a few minutes, needing time to gather himself, to quiet the storm inside. Megan was already upstairs when he walked in. The soft sound of the shower running told him she was washing up, maybe trying to scrub away the guilt that he imagined must be weighing on her. James sat on the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. But the truth was, he didn't know how to react. There was no guidebook for how to handle betrayal, no instructions on how to process the kind of pain that was ripping him apart inside. A few minutes later, Megan emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a silk robe. When she saw him sitting on the bed, she froze for a moment, her expression betraying a flicker of hesitation. But then, almost instantly, she masked it with a forced smile. "Hey, love. Are you all right? You're home early tonight," she said casually, as if nothing had happened, as if everything was perfectly normal. James stared at her in silence, his throat tight, his emotions choking back the words he wanted to say. He had no idea where to even begin, but he knew they had to talk. Megan must have sensed the tension in the air because her smile faltered, and a trace of unease crept into her expression. "Megan, we need to talk," he finally managed to say, his voice heavy with the pain he had been holding back. She blinked in surprise, taken aback by the seriousness in his tone. Of course, about what? James drew in a long, shaky breath, fighting to stay calm despite the chaos swirling inside him. I know what's going on. I know you've been betraying me. Megan's eyes widened, and for a brief second, the color drained from her face. But just as quickly, she seemed to gather herself, letting out a sigh as she sat down beside him on the bed. James, I can explain. Explain what? He cut her off, his voice growing firmer, the weight of his hurt pushing him forward. You betrayed me, Megan. I saw you. I followed you tonight. I saw you with that man. The silence that followed was suffocating. Megan stared down at her hands, her eyes welling up with tears, but no words came out. It was as if she knew that whatever she said wouldn't change the truth he now held. She had been caught, and there was no escaping it. I didn't want it to be like this, James, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. I felt so lost, so trapped these last few months. I thought maybe if I found something outside of here, it would help me find what I'd lost inside. And you thought cheating on the man who loves you would be the answer. James's voice came out laced with bitterness, a mix of pain and anger spilling over. Megan met his eyes for the first time since they had started talking, her tears falling silently, but James felt no pity. His hurt ran far too deep to be softened by her tears. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I was lost, James. I don't know how else to explain it. I still love you, I swear. I never wanted to lose you. He laughed, but it was a dry, empty sound, devoid of humor. Love? That's not love, Megan. Love doesn't destroy, it doesn't deceive. Love builds, it sacrifices, it fights. What you did was tear apart everything we built. Megan didn't have an answer. Her silence only confirmed what James already knew. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Finally, after a long pause, she took a deep breath and, in a soft voice, said, maybe we can try something different, James. I know I made a mistake, but I still want us to be together. Maybe we can open up our marriage, make things more free, without so many rules. James stared at her in disbelief, the pain slowly morphing into a mix of anger and contempt. An open marriage, Megan. That's your solution. You betrayed me, and now you think the way to fix this is to open up what we spent years building? Do you honestly believe that's going to solve anything? She didn't respond right away. Her suggestion, so cold and calculated, left him stunned. Everything he had worked for, all the sacrifices he had made, was being treated as casually as someone would suggest rearranging the furniture. The emptiness inside him grew, and James realized that this wasn't just a physical betrayal. It was something deeper. It was the destruction of everything he had believed in, the collapse of the life he thought was solid. Megan tried to move closer to him, reaching out, but James recoiled, unable to bear her touch. James, I really think this could work. We could still be together, just, in a different way. I don't want to lose you. Lose me? Megan, you've already lost me. He stood up from the bed, looking down at her, feeling the weight of every word he was about to say. Do you really think that some ridiculous, open arrangement will fix what you did? That watching me be with someone else from time to time is going to erase the pain I'm feeling right now? Megan lowered her head, the tears flowing more freely now, but to James, they meant nothing anymore. He knew that whatever they had between them was beyond repair. Her suggestion wasn't just absurd, it was the final nail in the coffin, confirming that any hope he might have had was now dead. But even still, there was something more. Something Megan wasn't telling him. James could sense it. Her desperate proposal felt like it was masking something deeper, a secret she hadn't yet revealed. The thought that there was still something left unsaid gnawed at him. He turned and left the room, leaving Megan in tears. Each step he took down the hall felt heavier, like the weight on his chest was pressing down harder with every move. But at the same time, a voice inside him screamed that this wasn't the last truth he'd hear tonight. Something darker was still lurking beneath the surface. James slammed the bedroom door behind him, his hands trembling with anger. He stomped down the stairs, each step feeling heavier, as if the ground beneath him was about to give way. His mind was racing with Megan's words, her absurd suggestion to open their marriage, as if that could erase the betrayal she had already committed. The silence in the house felt suffocating, and the air was thick, making it hard to breathe. He made his way to the living room and collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. He was emotionally drained, completely exhausted, but he knew the conversation with Megan was far from over. What gnawed at him wasn't just the betrayal, it was the nagging feeling that there was something else, something deeper still lurking in the shadows. The affair, as painful as it was, felt like just the tip of the iceberg. Something darker hung between them, waiting to be revealed. A few minutes later, he heard the soft sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Megan appeared at the doorway, her eyes still red and puffy from crying. She stood there, unsure whether to approach or give him space. But James knew this had to end. He needed the full truth, no matter how much it would hurt, even if it broke him completely. "James," Megan began, her voice shaky and uncertain. "Please listen to me. I know suggesting we open the marriage, it was ridiculous. I was desperate, grasping at anything to save what we have. But that doesn't change what I did. I betrayed you, and I know you may never forgive me for that, but there's more you need to know." James lifted his head, his eyes locking onto hers, waiting for her to continue. He braced himself, knowing that whatever came next would be hard to hear. Something deep inside urged him to uncover the whole truth, no matter the cost. Megan slowly stepped toward him and sat in the armchair across from where he sat. She took a deep breath, like she was preparing to release a burden she had carried for too long. "It wasn't just this one time, James," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I've cheated on you, multiple times." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. It was as if the ground beneath him vanished, leaving him free-falling into an abyss. He had known there was more to the story, but he hadn't expected it to be this devastating. For a moment, he was too shocked to respond, too numb to react. He simply stared at her, waiting for her to explain. "I didn't plan this, I swear," Megan continued, her tears returning as she spoke. "It just happened, little by little. At first, it was harmless flirting, just small moments where I felt alive again, felt different. I don't even know when it crossed the line. But by the time I realized, I was already too deep." James shook his head, trying to push her words away, but they echoed in his mind, refusing to leave. He shot up from the couch, pacing around the room with his hands tangled in his hair, struggling to process what he had just heard. The emptiness in his stomach twisted into a physical ache, a deep wound of betrayal that left him gasping for air. "How many times, Megan? With how many people?" His voice finally emerged, shaky and trembling with fury that he could barely contain. Megan lowered her head, her shoulders shaking as the tears flowed harder. I don't know exactly. More than once, with two different people." Her voice broke as she added, "I never wanted it to end up like this, James. I was confused, trapped. I felt suffocated. I know none of this justifies what I did, but I didn't know how to deal with what was happening inside me." James's anger surged, bubbling up inside him like lava, and he felt an overwhelming urge to scream, to smash something, anything, to release the pain exploding in his chest. "And you thought opening the marriage was the solution to this?" He shook his head, disbelief etched into every word. "Do you really think that more betrayal would fix what you've already destroyed?" Megan's sobs grew louder, her words coming out in shaky gasps. "I didn't know what else to do, James. I was lost. I thought maybe if you, had more freedom, I could somehow make up for what I'd done. I was trying to find a way to not lose you." James stopped pacing, staring at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of raw pain and seething anger. "But you've already lost me, Megan. You lost me the moment you chose to betray the trust one gave you. This isn't about freedom, it's about respect. And it's clear you don't have any left for me or for what we had." Desperate, Megan stood up and walked toward him, grabbing his hands, her tear-streaked face pleading for redemption in the chaos she had created. "Please, James. I know I was wrong, but I still love you. I still want to save what we had. I would do anything to fix this." He yanked his hands away from hers, stepping back. "Save it? Megan, you've destroyed everything. And you knew what you were doing every single time you went out with them. And now you expect me to just accept it? Pretend like none of this happened?" She collapsed into sobs, covering her face with her hands, unable to look at him. The pain in James's head pounded like a drum, but there was something more. A nagging feeling told him that she hadn't told him the whole story yet. He knew it. There was still something bigger left to reveal, and it haunted him. "Who are they, Megan?" His voice cut through her sobs. "Who are the men you cheated on me with?" She hesitated, looking up at him, her expression twisted in panic. "Does it matter?" James crossed his arms, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "Of course it matters. I deserve to know who you broke our promises with." Megan took a shaky breath, struggling to pull herself together. "One of them, you don't know. He's a coworker. Someone I got involved with while I was traveling. It was a mistake." She paused, then continued, her voice quieter. "And the other?" James stayed silent, waiting for the final blow, knowing it was coming. "The other, is someone you know. Someone close to us." Her voice dropped to a whisper. James felt a cold chill run down his spine, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who, Megan? Who?" She hesitated again, her hands trembling as they gripped the arm of the couch. Then, finally, she looked at him, her red, tear-filled eyes meeting his. "It's Chris. Your best friend." The impact of her words hit him like a sledgehammer, immediate and devastating. Chris. The friend he had grown up with, the one he'd shared secrets, joys, and heartbreaks with. Chris, the person he trusted most in the world, the one who had always been by his side through the good times and the bad. It was with him that Megan had betrayed him. The ground seemed to vanish beneath James's feet, leaving him free-falling into a bottomless pit. Megan's betrayal had already been unbearable, but now it had spiraled into something beyond comprehension. It wasn't just his wife, it was his best friend. The one person he had trusted blindly. James felt the rage consume him, but it was a fury with no outlet, a crushing weight that took away whatever control he still had left. Megan took a step back, fear flickering in her eyes, as if bracing herself for his reaction. But James didn't move. He stood there, staring at her, disbelief written all over his face. He had no words. He didn't know what to say or even what to think. Megan's betrayal was already devastating, but knowing Chris was involved made it unbearable. What were you both thinking?" James's voice finally came out, hoarse and thick with bitterness. "How could you do this to me?" Megan shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, James. I don't know. It was a mistake, a series of mistakes. I got lost in the middle of it all. Chris, he was just there when I was vulnerable. I never meant for it to turn out like this." But her words were hollow now. Nothing she said could justify what she'd done, and the fact that Chris, his closest friend, had been part of it made it unforgivable. James took a step back, feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath him. Every part of his life felt like it was slipping through his fingers, being ripped away. He had to get out of there, away from Megan, away from everything. Without another word, James turned and walked toward the door. He left the house without looking back, the cold night air hitting his face as he wandered aimlessly through the dark streets. His head pounded from the weight of the revelation, and it wasn't just Megan's betrayal that consumed him, it was the betrayal of Chris, his lifelong friend. It was a double blow, a wound so deep that he couldn't fathom how it could ever heal. Anger and despair twisted together inside his chest, creating a storm of emotions that left him feeling like he was on the edge of collapsing. The streets were empty, the quiet of the night amplifying the turmoil within him. Everything around him felt meaningless now. Each step he took was heavy, as though the world itself was unraveling with every move he made. He stopped in front of a park, the same park where, years ago, he and Chris used to meet to talk. How many times had they sat there, side by side, sharing their dreams, their plans for the future? Now, every one of those memories was stained by betrayal. James sat down on one of the cold, wooden benches, the chill seeping through his clothes and into his skin. His mind raced, desperate for answers to questions he didn't even know how to ask. How could Chris, someone so close, have done this? And how did Megan have the nerve to cross that line, knowing it would destroy everything? The questions echoed in his mind, over and over, without answers, without logic. James knew he'd never truly understand why they had done what they did, and that realization only fueled his pain. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he scrolled to Chris's name in his contacts. The dilemma twisted inside him: should he confront Chris now, while his anger was still fresh? Should he wait until he calmed down? Or should he just cut all ties and pretend like he never knew? None of the options felt right. The situation was too big, too complicated to be solved with a single decision. But he couldn't leave things as they were. He needed answers. He had to face the man he once called a brother and understand what had pushed him to cross such a line. Before he could think it over any longer, he pressed the call button. The phone rang several times before Chris picked up, his voice calm and carefree, an instant source of irritation to James. James. Hey, man, what's up? Chris's voice was familiar, but now it grated against him like a cruel joke. James gripped the phone tightly, his breathing uneven. For a few seconds, he couldn't speak, struggling to keep his composure. I know, Chris. His voice finally broke the silence, low and filled with restrained fury. I know about you and Megan. The silence on the other end was immediate, no words, no sounds. Just the crushing weight of the truth hanging between them. James could practically hear the panic rising in Chris's mind through the silence, and it only stoked his fury further. James, man, I can explain, Chris finally stammered, his voice hesitant, laced with guilt. Explain. James shot back, his voice trembling with rage. You think there's something that can be explained? How do you justify betraying the trust of someone you called a friend? How do you explain something like this? It wasn't planned. I swear, James. I never wanted things to go this far. I don't even know how it happened. I was just there for Megan, and one day it changed. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. James let out a bitter laugh, sharp and full of contempt. A mistake. You and Megan cheated on me, repeatedly, and now you're trying to call it a mistake. Chris, you've destroyed everything. Everything I believed in, everything I thought was solid. Chris sighed on the other end, his guilt and desperation clear in every breath. I know, man. I know. Nothing I say can fix what I've done. I betrayed you in a way that can't be undone. But I need you to understand, despite everything, I never wanted to hurt you. I got lost, just like Megan. We both made terrible choices, and now we're here. James was silent for a moment, trying to absorb Chris's words. The pain still smoldered inside him, but now there was something else. A hollowness. No matter how much regret Chris had, no matter how much he tried to apologize, nothing could undo the damage. Their friendship was dead, just like his marriage to Megan. "I don't know what you expect me to do with this, Chris. I lost my wife and my best friend all at once. And for what? For a moment of weakness? For a series of selfish decisions you both made?" The exhaustion weighed on James's voice, which had once been filled with nothing but rage, but was now laced with resignation. "I know you can't forgive me," Chris responded quietly. "I know nothing can change what happened. But James, I'm here. If you need to hate me for the rest of your life, I'll take it. I just needed you to know that I regret all of this too." James didn't say another word. He simply hung up the phone, the silence ringing louder than any conversation could. Nothing Chris felt, no amount of remorse, would change what had already happened. The betrayal was done, the damage irreparable. And now, all James felt was desolation, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer existed. As the quiet of the night enveloped him, James realized he was trapped in an impossible situation. Should he confront Megan again? Cut Chris out of his life forever? Or simply vanish, leaving everything behind to start over from scratch? Each option felt equally unbearable, the weight of those decisions overwhelming him. He stood up from the bench, taking a long breath of the cold night air. He knew he had to go home, face Megan one more time. But deep down, the reality that his life had irrevocably changed was unavoidable. The betrayal had torn everything apart, and now, all that remained was a broken man trying to navigate the rubble of his once whole world. James walked back to the house with heavy steps, the weight of his shattered life pressing down on his shoulders. The silence inside was thick, almost suffocating. Megan sat on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes swollen and red from crying. She hadn't moved since he left. She looked small, diminished, a shadow of the woman he had once loved. He stopped at the doorway, watching her for a moment. The anger and hurt that had once burned inside him were now replaced by a numbness, an emptiness that swallowed everything else. Megan slowly lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes, but said nothing. The silence between them was suffocating, louder than any argument they could have had. James sat down in the armchair across from her, the air between them heavy with finality. For a few moments, neither spoke. It felt like they had already said everything that needed to be said, yet both knew this would be the last conversation. The tension had shifted, it wasn't the tension of unresolved anger or conflict. This was the tension of an ending. "I called Chris," James finally broke the silence, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Megan didn't react. She just nodded, as if she had expected it. "I don't know what to do with what he said. Just like I don't know what to do with what you did. But, Megan, there is no more us." His words were firm, but they no longer held anger, just acceptance. Tears streamed down Megan's face again, quietly, as if she already knew there was no more fight left. She wanted to beg for forgiveness once more, but she knew it was pointless. James was beyond forgiveness. She could hear it in his voice, see it in the hollow look he gave her. "I'm leaving, Megan," he said, standing up, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. "I'm going to leave you with this, with the choices you've made. There's nothing left for me here. Our marriage is over." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands, the muffled sound of her crying filling the room. But James didn't waver. He knew this was the only way forward, for both of them. The love they once shared had been destroyed, not just by the betrayal, but by the broken trust, the lies, the promises that had been shattered. "James, please, forgive me," she managed to choke out between sobs, her voice strained with pain. "I know I messed up, but I still love you. I still want to fix this." James looked at her for a moment, his expression empty. There was something heartbreaking about her plea, but at the same time, he knew none of it mattered anymore. The love she claimed to feel no longer meant anything to him. "Some things can't be fixed, Megan," he said quietly. "Some things, once broken, can never be put back together." He turned and walked toward the door. Megan remained seated, watching as he left the home they had built together, knowing he would never return. The sound of the door closing echoed through the now empty house, and Megan felt her world crumble completely. James was gone, and with him, everything she once thought she had. Outside, James took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill his lungs. He walked to his car, knowing it was the last time he'd see the house that had held so many memories. The life he knew was officially over. He knew it would take time for the wounds to heal, but at least now, he was free to start over. Weeks passed. James distanced himself from everything and everyone, taking time to be alone, away from Megan, away from Chris, away from the life he once knew. Chris had tried reaching out a few times, but James ignored him. There was no room for that kind of friendship in his life anymore. Chris's betrayal was just as unforgivable as Megan's, and James knew he could never trust him again. Megan, on the other hand, faced the full consequences of her actions. She lost not only her husband but also her circle of friends, who quickly found out what had happened. Chris, after being confronted by James, ended the affair with her. Now, Megan was left with nothing but her own loneliness, consumed by shame and regret for the choices she had made. As for James, far removed from the life he once knew, he began to rebuild his own story. He decided to travel, to find new paths, leaving the past behind. He knew the pain of betrayal would follow him for a while, but he also knew that, in time, life would make sense again. The scars would remain, but he would move on, stronger and wiser. For Megan, the ending wasn't happy. Guilt and remorse ate away at her, and she found herself trapped in a life of regret. Chris, too, found himself isolated, without James's friendship and with a damaged reputation among their mutual friends. Both paid the price for the choices they made, and it was far more than they ever anticipated. But James found peace in his fresh start. He learned that even after betrayal and pain, life continues. And as time passed, he realized that starting over is often the best way to leave the past behind and move forward.